An opportunity to talk to you guys today. And this program, I call it Goat Production from the Goat's Perspective. It's a different kind of a look. We all go out and we start to raise animals, and we have to find information about raising animals, and you guys are just saying, I'm interested in raising goats. But what we're going to come from today is the perspective of the goat, not necessarily the person who wants to raise them, because these animals, we've got to know a little bit about their history and about their backgrounds. Maybe it will tell us better how to raise these animals. So one of the things I do in Extension, I'm the county extension educator in Fulton County, that's up in Rochester, Indiana, 3 counties down from the state line. I come from a farm background. I was raised on a farm, and I currently live on a farm, and I have goats and I have beef cattle on my farm. And so I was just thinking this morning, right before we came in here, that I have been around livestock and animals all my life. My degree's in animal science from South Dakota State University. That's my master's. My bachelor's is from Purdue. So I've been around it all my life, and I can tell you that I have been raising goats for 40 years. Now that sounds impressive. It really does, because not a lot of people can say that. And that's really, really impressive. I've also been using computers for 40 years. Okay? I have no clue what I'm doing with a computer. I have been driving a car for well over 40 years, but I still couldn't go out and drive the Indy 500. So it's all in perspective when we talk about this. When people say they've got lots of experience, they really have good experience. Let's put it that way. And so that's the thing I worry about. So in Extension, one of the things I've learned through the years is I get a lot of questions on a lot of different things. And sometimes you've got to go backwards and think about the origins and what we're dealing with and answer those questions. So I just put a question. Steve, I'm not going. No, it didn't do it.
That's the comment about computers.
Yeah. There you go. I've been dealing with computers for 40 years. All right. So the aspect I come from is one of these. I'll get a call from a person with horses. And by the way, that's one aspect I'm not good at is horses. I've never been involved with horses, and so I'll put myself out of that one right off the bat. But they'll talk about pastures, horse pasture. And they'll say, I want to have a horse pasture, and I need some way to improve my horse pasture. Well, you know, I could go out there, or I got this weed, and this weed right here is buckhorn, and I had this the other day. So I got this buckhorn growing in my pasture. How do I kill that out of there? Well, I've been around long enough to know the problem is not the weed. The problem is the production management that's going on. They're turning a bunch of horses on a small acreage. They're eating it in the ground, and the only thing that's going to come through that is buckhorn. So it is not a case of what do I spray, and that's what they were asking. What do I spray on this weed? In reality, it is, no, we need to look at the holistic approach here. We need to do management on this whole pasture, and that's what we need to do. So I think that's one of the aspects that we're getting at. I'll go from another point. I have coined the term I use quite a bit of plant psychology. And I do a lot of programming for master gardeners. Plant psychology, that seems a little ridiculous, doesn't it? But what I'm going to ask you, and this is what I ask my master gardeners, what is a plant's goal in life? And that answer is to reproduce the species. That's the answer for that plant, is to goal in life is to reproduce a species. And I've got a tomato plant up here, and I know that if you take a tomato plant and you grow a tomato plant and you fertilize it with all sorts of nitrogen, it's just going to grow and grow and grow and just, oh man, life is good and things are great. And you know, I'll throw out a couple tomatoes and reproduce my species here a little bit, but I don't have to do much because man, it's great. So people who fertilize their tomatoes a lot get all this growth, but very few tomatoes. Because you've got to understand the psychology of what we're dealing with of that plant. Well, it's obviously the same in livestock, and it's the same thing with animals. And our goal in livestock production is not to have this. And that's a goat that's on the necropsy table dying from some kind of problem. And this happens. It happens all too frequently when we have a lot of people who get into the production who really need to know how to raise animals to begin with. Cute little goats. Oh, they're fun. They look great. Let's go out there. Let's raise some goats. And there are a variety of problems you can have. There are diseases. There are feeding situations. Our goal and my goal today is to try to keep this from happening. It will happen. It happened to me this year on something I've never had before. But it does happen in our situation. So last year, I had a brand new 4-H kid come to my farm. That 4-H kid wanted to raise goats for the first time. I sold him goats. He took them home. 2 weeks later, one was dead. 2 more weeks later, the other one was dead. That quickly. My wife spends a tremendous amount of time going over lots of 2 hours at least with these people, going over things back and forth. And the last thing she'll say, call me. If you got any problems whatsoever, call me. So she reads on Facebook about these goats dying. We never got a call about it. We never had an opportunity to talk to people about really what was going on. So even though we went through everything with these animals, these 2 goats died of urinary calculi. If you're going to raise goats, you will have urinary calculi problems. There are things you can do that you have to look out for to try to prevent urinary calculi from happening. The reason they died from urinary calculi, they were giving these goats no hay whatsoever. They were just giving them grain. So somewhere in this process, we didn't tell them to feed them hay, but somehow they got the idea they didn't have to feed any roughages to these animals, and they got a urinary calculi problem. So I'm not going into urinary calculi and cause and effects today, but just realize that we have problems in raising these animals. So I'm going to talk to you about goat psychology today, and I'm going to start out with where this species came from to begin with. I'm going to go way back to that time period to know where they came from to begin with. This is the origin of the goat species. This area of the country right here, kind of what we call the cradle of civilization, if you've heard of that terminology. Turkey and Iran is where the goat comes from. So let's go to that location. I have never been there, but I know from reading a little bit about it. Let's go to Turkey and Iran. Does that look like Indiana to you? No, it does not. Does that look like the goats we're raising in Indiana? No, it does not. But this is the origin of that species. And as we look at this picture, we see a rough, rocky ground, great big horns, a group of animals together. These are all important things to understand. A group of animals together, shrubby brush, kind of tall brush, very little grass in this situation, and that's where they're growing at. So what does that picture give to us? So first off, we know about the goats, because they originated in that area of the world, their mouths are different. You can take a cow, cow's got a great big old tongue, she goes out, swaps in some of this grass, and you take a goat, it's up here nibbling on top. Not down here, grazing that area, but up here nibbling is where they at. The area has very little grass. The rocks, when you raise goats, you have to trim hooves. Hoof trimming is very important, and the more grain that you give them, the more hooves or trimmings you're going to have to do. And because of that, in this area with all these rocks, they trim their own hooves. On my farm, we don't have those rocks like that, but they would. Some people do throw rock piles out to help them a little bit along that line. They don't have any grain, and we'll talk about grain later on. Yeah, there may be a few seeds on some of those plants, but not very much at all. They have those horns for defense, and they know how to use them. And if you deal with goats, you know they know how to use them. They have that herd instinct. They want to be together. That shows up here also. So having individual animals by themselves is something they don't like at all. They are a prey species. They are something that's going to get ate on by some predator. And because of that, they want to be in a group, they feel safe in a group, and they still have that methodology in their heads, even out on our farms where we're working with them at. They want to be up high, and if you look at that area, that is not a goat that's going to be suffering from worm issues. Okay, and we're going to talk a little bit about worm issues as we get into this thing too. Not a lot, but we think about that's why they don't have worm issues there. And the fact of the matter is the goats were domesticated 8,000 years ago. That sounds really kind of interesting to me, But the reality is they were domesticated in that part of the world 8,000 years ago and really have not had an opportunity to move out of that area of the world for a long, long time. So there is a lot of genetic improvement going on, but that genetic improvement is happening there, not in the United States, and sure not 8,000 years ago, because I look at my farm has been in the family for 150 years, and it's only been farmed maybe 180 years. So we don't have that kind of genetic improvement going on here that we had going that long ago. So I'll show you just a different example here. If we take a look at cattle, cattle again were domesticated about 8,000, 10,000 years ago. And if you look at this chart on how they were domesticated, the Brahmas type animals were down in India and those areas. They were domesticated in a hot, dry environment. And in the United States, we have them down in Texas, places like that, which is a hot, dry environment. The other types of cattle that we have, which are the Angus, the Shorthorn, the Herefords, those type, they were domesticated in this area, but they were going clear up to Europe. There was a lot of production going on in Europe, a lot of years of domestication in Europe long before they came to the United States. So those people did a lot of breeding. What's Europe like? Kind of like here. A lot of grasses, northern environment, cool area. So we have domesticated cows in an area of the world that's kind of similar to us. On the other hand, goats, we have not done that. So this is a hard map to see, but it's a density map. And it talks about where the majority of our cattle are at in the world, United States, Europe, and then we get down into India, of course, and that's the humped type cattle you want to look at. That's where it's at. Goats, domestication of goats, well, where they're at right now, we don't have much in the United States. We got a tremendous amount, again, in that part of the world. Some are down here in southern areas, South Africa, and out in Asia in some areas like that. So the point being, they haven't been domesticated very long. There's not been a lot of breeding going on in the types of environment that we have in the United States. That's not there, and so there's a lot of genetics that still has to be done to these animals that get them used to what we have in the United States. So the boar goat, for example, is the one I want to talk about. So it was it was bred and put into production in South Africa. So let's take a look at South Africa. 17 inches of rain a year. We get 35, somewhere around that. Cold, just under freezing at the lowest. Gee, it was 20 below at my place this year. Hot, less than 90 degrees Fahrenheit for the most time, and that's what it looks like. That's Indiana, isn't it? Yeah? Not at all. Not even close. So we bring them boar goats over here from an environment that looks like that they're very, very effective in. We drop them on our farms, and now we start raising them in that kind of a situation, is what we're dealing with. So they're just not used to what we've got here in Indiana. And one of the things that genetically they have an issue with when we bring them in here to Indiana is the worm issue. Now, I'll go through that just very briefly because I don't want to assume everybody knows what's going on. But so they have a type of nematode, a type of roundworm that's called Haemachus contortus, and it is called the barber pole worm. And if you look here, it's red and white and red and white. That's why it gets that barber pole name. That worm goes into the gut, and it attaches to the gut. And while it's attaching to the gut, it's drawing the blood out of the animal. That's the red in that worm. Drawing that blood out of the animal and spitting out eggs. Those eggs eventually pass out, drop into the feces, drop into the ground. Then what that worm does, it hatches out, and it crawls up a very short distance on a blade of grass. It finds that morning droplet of dew, and right inside of there is all sorts of worms. And so when my goat comes along and eats that morning grass with that nice dew on it there, I am taking those worms into my body, or my goat's body, and then it's infecting into that goat. So in a dry environment like South Africa, we're not going to see all those morning dews or that rainfall like that. We don't have those kind of goat numbers coming up. The other thing about those worms, they don't like to go much more than 3 or 4 inches high. So in their native environment with those goats, we go back to our picture of what it looked like in Iran, they're eating up here. They're not eating down there. So goat production from the goat's perspective, we got to keep them from eating down here. We need to keep them eating up here somewhere. Higher the better. That's one of our things we can do for worm production. Because they weren't raised with really worm issues, they have a genetic disposition to getting worms. And there are a lot of people and a lot of research work that's been done that shows that you can breed resistance to worms, because that's a central thing that we have to do is get our goats so they're not having worm issues, because that is probably the biggest issue with raising goats there is. Oh, I can just give them dewormer. Well, a lot of the dewormers are getting to the point that they don't work anymore. Some absolutely don't work. Some may work on your farm, but not on my farm. But there's a lot of work that's been done to show that it's very genetic, the resistance to worms. And so in our country, we need to breed that resistance into worms. We also need to quit grazing down here too. Get off the ground and get up in the air as much as possible. Cattle, I mentioned here, we have worm issues in cattle, but they were in that wetter European environment. So it's not as big an issue with them as it is with goats. The other part of that is our cattle wormers are still working on cattle, and they're not building up the resistance that we're building up to in goats. So it's a really important part of goat production is to understand this worm cycle and try to beat that as much as possible in the production of goats. So I raise cattle and goats, both. This is my beef herd on the left, some of my goats eating on the right. I want to tell you, of the 2 different species, the cattle are by far the easiest species to grow. Now everybody will say, well, gee, they're great big huge cows, and I have to deal with these 12, 13, 1,400 pound cows, and I do. But I don't have near the problems in my cattle herd that I have in my goat herd. I don't have the issues of foot rot. Cattle can get foot rot, and I've had foot rot, but goats get foot rot all the time. I don't have the worm issues like I do. I don't have urinary calculi. They can get it, but I don't have an issue with it. So raising cattle is easier than raising goats. And everybody thinks, well, I'm just going to buy a goat. I'm going to go out and buy a goat, bring it home. It's no big deal. And you know what I'm going to do with that goat? I'm going to fence off that little spot right here in my yard, and I'm going to put it in that bluegrass, and we'll talk bluegrass later on, that's in my yard right there, and let them go ahead and just eat. Well, guess what? Bluegrass would be a perfect environment for having worms. Those worms would crawl up there, and by not moving them out of that area whatsoever, they just sit there and they just keep reinfecting themselves with worms over and over and over again. And so we got to rotate. We got to get them out of there into other locations. But if you don't know about worms, if you don't know those aspects, you need to learn that rotation aspect and what I need to do with it and other things that I can do to prevent them worms from going on. Cattle are really simple compared to goats. They're just big, that's all, just big. The other thing is goats make you more money than cattle do right now, so that's another part of it. Goats are really worth a lot more per pound than what cattle are. So one of the things goats like to do in nature is they like to be up high. And so when you raise goats on your place, putting a feed bunk out here, this is my cattle feed bunk, doesn't do me any bit of good whatsoever for goats, because that's what they'll end up doing is walking in that feed bunk like that. So that feed bunk just stays out there. Someday, if I run cattle through this pasture, I'll knock that feed bunk over and I may use it. But because they want to be up high, you got to outsmart them, or they'll outsmart you. Anytime you try something, they'll defeat you just about every time. And so one of the things they like to do is be up high. And so I can't just have a feed bunk like this, because they'll walk in it and get it all crappy, the feed that's in there. So that's what we're looking at. Sometimes goats really like to be up high, and that's the nature of them. That's their psychology. This is one standing on top of a shed I got here. That's a culvert. That's a culvert from under the road. If you put some flimsy kind of a house out there, they'll just crash it down. If they can jump up on top of it, they'll beat it down. And so you really need to make sure that you've got structures around there, if you're using them for housing, that are heavy enough to withstand the loads of those goats getting on top of there. So that's Maya. She was born on Cinco de Mayo, so my wife called her Maya. And that's Maya standing on that house. Right here is a fence, by the way, kind of a board decorative fence that I use right here between them. This past summer, Maya showed us her ability to fly, and she just jumps off that house and clears that fence and was out in our yard. And so I had to put a structure up about this high to keep her from clearing that fence. Doesn't look pretty anymore like it used to, but I had to stop Maya from jumping over our fence. And that's what she'll do in this situation. All right. One of the things we've done on our farm, because I know that goats will stand in their feed and then they won't eat that dirty feed, is we put our feed troughs, and this is an eaves trough is what it is. Works really, really well. I've also seen it done with plastic PVC pipe, like sewer pipe type thing. We put a hole through the fence and they eat through the fence, and that's how they do it. Now, it works very effective, except for, you see this one right here? She's big enough, she'll come right through that hole, or little enough, I should say, that she'll come right through that hole on me, and that's what she'll end up doing. And so you still have to deal with that of goats coming through like that. But we find that to be very effective. That stops our up high part. And I don't show a picture of it, I don't think, here. I have another location where I put a feed trough up here and have a place down here for them to stand and put their feet on so they can eat up there. So we got to outsmart them because they want to be up high. And so we got to prevent them from doing that, and that's what we do in our place. I mentioned this too, the cattle versus the goat kind of thing. They yank. You watch a goat, she'll go up to that leaf and she doesn't eat it, she yanks it off. I always tell people my goats are jerks. And they are. They are jerks. They jerk their food. They don't do what the cow does, that big old tongue going out low to the ground, bringing things in. They jerk their food. So because of that, one of the issues you have in goat production is the hay. When you put hay in a nice hay feeder, they jerk it out. They go up, they don't nibble on it, they jerk it out. And so you'll end up with just about as much hay on the ground as they got in their guts. And so finding a very good hay feeder that will work to try to prevent that is an important thing to do. And believe me, I am open to ideas from anybody who's found very good hay feeders that work to keep them from doing that. And I don't have any pictures of it. I saw one in a magazine the other day. I'd like to try, but I've got to stop preventing these guys from putting all this hay down on the ground because they will waste it quite a bit. But they are jerks. There's no doubt about it. Another thing that I always find about, and I've watched my goats for years, and this is not a great picture, and actually I ought to have had a picture of the place over here. So behind that shed back there is a lot that years ago I thought to myself, I'm not sure what I'm going to do with this. So I just seeded it to bluegrass. And I thought, I'll just put some bluegrass in there. So eventually I ended up turning the goats in there. And again, this is short bluegrass. But those goats would almost starve to death in that lot before. They weren't eating that bluegrass out there at all. They were not consuming that and doing a good job. In this lot here, which is over here, there's a lot of grass growing here. There's weeds growing out in here. This is an area that when my cattle are out there, they beat it down to mud. So this is not a pasture like I would think of as a pasture. It's just an area around the farm. Well, these species of grasses that come up in this area are species of grasses that maybe what ends up happening is that I will turn the cattle in there, and the cattle have been in here, and they have cleaned this down, but the goats don't like it. So I saw a really good program done by the University of Kentucky. And the University of Kentucky took goats out, and they gave them a preference study. What do you like to eat? Rather than me shoving bluegrass at them, this situation is, what do you prefer to eat? And as it turns out, like number 16, way down on the list, was bluegrass. They don't like bluegrass. They don't like it at all. And so I need to be thinking about my animals when I put things into those pastures, of putting things in there that are things that they enjoy and they like to eat. And so one of the things that tops the list up here is something called sorghum sudan grass. Bluegrass, sorghum sudan grass. Okay. Bluegrass, sorghum sudan grass. Now, do we got a worm thing here we can think of right off the bat? Okay. So we're eating up here and not down here, so we got a worm thing. But beyond that, we've got a taste thing. They like the taste of that sorghum sudan grass. That girl right there is eating sorghum, big, tall sorghum sudan grass. And that was their number one thing that they like to consume. On down the list was white clover. Wait a minute, that's down here. Okay, so they like white clover, but I'm not so inclined to be putting white clover out in my pasture because I don't want to have that issue. Turnips. Turnips get up pretty good size, get leafy, and it's also kind of a cool weather time of the year, which is actually when the worms are less active, so I can get by with those things. Red clover, which from my standpoint is the number one legume forage that I like to have. My dad, my family, for generations have been seeding red clover on our farm, and we really see the benefits of it, not only for the crops, but how you can put red clover in a grass situation, and the red clover will feed the nitrogen to the grass, and it works as a good feed and also a nitrogen source. Chicory, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. Another one that they really like is Sericia Lespedeza. You guys in southern Indiana sometimes grow that, and goat production will grow that as a possibility. That's a very controversial plant because it's also tremendously invasive, and I think the state just put them on the can't plant list as invasive species. So it's an issue. It's a really great goat feed, but it's got other issues. I'm not familiar with tall oak grass. Alfalfa's in there, some of the warm season grass. Here's the one that really gets me. I'm up in northern Indiana. We produce, for cattle, we do alfalfa orchard grass. That's our rotation, that's our combination. And probably one of the things that cattle hate is reed canary grass. Well, actually here, the goats took the reed canary grass before they took the orchard grass. On my farm, I've got an old pond that dried up. Those goats went in there, and I tell you, they wiped out those cattails. They had no problem whatsoever wiping out those cattails in that situation. It's in there. So I think this is an interesting slide. So taking that information to my farm, this was that place that was bluegrass at one time. I ripped it up, and I put it to brown midrib sorghum. The brown midrib refers to this vein that's right down the middle of the leaf there. And in brown midrib, that vein is brown. And it's kind of something that Purdue actually discovered years ago, that brown midrib is actually more tastier and has more protein and is a better source of sorghum sudan grass. So if you're going to be planting it, you're going to want to plant brown midrib is what you really want to do. So these are my animals turned out into that field, and see how they're eating up high? That's what I want. And they're all sitting there consuming it. I'm going to talk about the other parts of it here in a little bit. But they really do a good job. They wipe that area out. I take them off there. It comes back with a second regrowth, which is not anything like the first, but it does get a second regrowth on there, and it's an annual crop. So I put it in the ground middle of May every year if I'm going to do this. And it really works out as a great feed. I would prefer to have a perennial forage out there, something I only have to plant once, but this one's a really good one to plant. They like it.
Can you bale that stuff?
Yeah, you can bale it. The problem with sorghum sudan grass is it takes about 5 good days of drying, and you don't get 5 good days of drying. So there are people who nowadays you can do baleage, wet wrap, people that do it that way for cattle, but I've never done baleage on goats, but you can do that. Yeah.
How tall do you want a grass like that, or like before you
Okay, so I don't want to see a seed head. That's what I don't want to see. So that's what I try to get. So I want it, so it depends how much I got out there. It's just like any other hay crop, when you start out, it's going to be this tall, but by the time you're done, some of it may be this tall. So I kind of come in about this height and start in about right in here somewhere, a little over, in, I guess, 4 foot. And I start in, and I really try to get them before the seed head starts to show up on them, is what I do. Yeah?
Repeat the questions for the
Okay.
recording.
Oh, yes, because I'm being recorded. The question that I was just asked is how tall do you want to have it when you want to start grazing it? I do it about here, about where those goats were. I mean, I just turned them in there.
How tall is here for the recording?
Yeah, recording to here is about a little over my hip height. So I'd say 3 to 4 foot around that area. But see, they don't have any seed heads out there and on that situation. Chicory. I mentioned chicory beforehand in that slide set. Chicory is one of those really good forages we need to take a look at. And so I started planting a chicory on my place, and this is some chicory right here out in my one pasture area. In fact, this last year I put chicory out because in an area because a really tremendous amount of chicory. Chicory is a perennial, and it should be there for several years. And I'm going to see on my place what several years amounts to on the soil types that I've got. It is something that needs to have nitrogen put on it. So in my chicory, when I put out this field that I put out last year, I put alfalfa and red clover into that both to hopefully supply nitrogen into it. Goats will be eating chicory. Chicory gets up high, usually higher than this, but it's got a lot of grass around this. They like chicory. And the interesting thing about chicory is it does have some properties that help with the worms. There's some properties to it that help prevent worms. I ain't going to stake my whole farm on chicory and worms, but there are properties and there's things in it that help prevent the worms. So if you know chicory, maybe you're used to seeing these blue flowers down along the road in about July sometime. That's chicory. But that's not the chicory I'm talking about. The chicories that we use are called forage type chicories, and they're more leafy than this. But they will get that blue flower on them like that. And here's a couple years ago we had a tremendous chicory year, and you saw them in July. But that's chicory growing down along the road. Chicory was cultivated as early as 5,000 years ago by the Egyptians. Jeez, we're going back to that area of the world again here where the goats came from. So this may have been a crop that was utilized for production of goats in those countries also. And so it's something they're used to eating. And again, it's not a really tall crop, but it gets up about 2 foot maybe sometimes in that area. And they will eat it down, and then you pull them out of there, and they push his leaves back on it again, and it eats them down. Now that one looked very vegetative, but they do get a stalk on them when they get up that tall. And so you want to look at it. So I really try to push people to thinking about putting some chicory out there. You can get it at your seed dealers, and you would want to look at that. All right, we talked about grain. When we were out in that area, there's no grain in that part of the world. And I want to tell you that grain is a drug. It really is a drug. It does things to animals that's really interesting. And what it ends up doing is when animals consume grain, it goes into their system and it produces a hormone called serotonin. Serotonin is the feel-good drug. And because it makes them feel good, the serotonin that's produced in there, they just love it. And it's like they get their own little drug addiction here with grain. And if you're around goats and grain, you know perfectly well how addicted to grain that they are. They will kill virtually just to get to that grain that's out there. So grain is a drug. Corn, wheat, barley, oats, all these things are high in carbohydrate. These are all grains. These are all really essentially drugs to that animal. And serotonin is the feel-good drug. It's secreted from the gut, goes into the brain, and usually it's in diets that are high in grain, I've always thought. The other thing it found out is it also increases domination. What happens at that feed bunk when we're eating grain? The very aggressive girls or boys are even more aggressive in that situation. And so not only are they genetically maybe aggressive as goats, But beyond that, we're giving them a drug that even makes them more aggressive. So my point being with this, I am not anti-grain, but I'm just explaining to you that grain causes some of these kind of things, and some of the actions that we see of goats may be related to that grain. When we feed grain to goats, we get a lot of hoof growth. We got to watch the hooves a lot in that situation, and we also have to take care of it and make sure of we don't overfeed grain. So, another little thing about goats, and you see this happening on your production, the goat queen. And it's common for a doe who is just kidded to try to upgrade her pecking order. And so, in our farm, we have individual pens where our goats are taken to, and they have their kids in those pens. And of course, right the minute we put them back together, even though they've been apart for a few days, they'll be out there beating on each other. And so to try to establish that pecking order, and they can get very aggressive even though they've been away for a few days. So a part of the thing about goats is the fact that they are very aggressive, and sometimes they'll do, by their nature, things like that. Goats will eat dirt, but they will not eat dirty feed. Have you ever seen them do that? I've seen sod sometime. I have seen them nibble on sod like they were after the salt or something that might be in there. And that's what this guy's doing right here. He's licking that rock right there. But if they stand in their feed or they get dirt in their feed, boom, man, they are finicky, extremely finicky. So it's up to us to make sure we've got a feeding system that keeps that dirt, hooves, footprints out of the feed. And it's really our job to do those kind of things because they are very, very finicky. They don't like wet feet. I had all these cattails out there, and when that pond dried up, man, they were all right over there eating it. But they would not, in any way, shape, or form, get into that area and get to it until that water was gone. If you'll notice, your dairy goats, at the first sight of a drop of rain, they're gone. They've got to be in something or out of the rain. Boar goats seem to handle it a lot better. Genetically, for some reason, they are used to a little bit more rain. And so they will find themselves not running out of the rain so fast. But they do not like it wet. In fact, and I bring that up because you look at that environment, there's no wet there in that environment at all. So here's on my place. Again, this is a lot that I had cattle in. And because it was a lot that had cattle in it, you have grass growing up, and this is foxtail. This is yellow foxtail. Nobody in the animal kingdom likes to eat yellow foxtail, by the way. So I can turn goats in here, and this is one of the things they're just not going to consume, or cattle, either one, in that situation. So I could turn them into this lot, and back here is a shed. Now I know goats don't like it when it rains, and so if I did that, they have that shed to go back there, and they get out of. But if I turn them in the lot up here, the other instinct that comes in here that you've got to watch is that herd instinct. And as they go across here, if this is really tall that we're looking at, there could be something out there that's going to eat me. And I'm scared about something out there that might be eating me. And so even though they want to be out of the grain, they won't do that. So what I ended up doing to that field, this is another view of it, and that's my house in the background. I ended up putting in a crop out there. I went to a program and they were selling pollinator crops. I thought that'd be kind of neat. I'll sow this pollinator crop. Most of that out there is buckwheat, by the way. I'll sow this pollination crop out there, get some benefit from the pollinators, get some blooms off of it, and graze it down by the goats. And I did that, and it wasn't the best idea I've ever had. That lot right now is the lot that I just put into chicory. But they consumed it and they ate it down. But the one thing about it was that when they went into that lot, if you watch them eat that tall stuff, they start right here and they eat, and they go like, the old cows, they'd be clear across the other end of it somewhere, but not the goats. We're not going out there because we can't see out there, and we don't know what's out there that might eat us. And by the way, that stuff has a lot of dew on it in the morning, and then it'll get wet. So I don't want to be wet. And so they don't do that. And so they'll start at the beginning and they'll work their way to it. So it doesn't do me any good. That shed I was talking about is parked right back here. when they were getting no use out of that shed if it rained, because they were not going back to it, because they were not going into that area, because that's the way they think. And so we ate that whole area down. Unfortunately, there was a whole lot of pigweed that came up in that area, and pigweed can be an issue that really bothers me. I know it has potential to be toxic, and it really bothered me. There was so much pigweed in that lot, and so it did bother me. So that is all chicory right now, is what that's been put out to, because that was gone. All right. If my goats get out, the first thing they find on my place is the rose bushes. It is by far their favorite thing to eat. And that's why roses are an excellent, goats are an excellent thing to consume multiflora rose. This will be the first thing that they get picked on in my place, are those roses. So I got to thinking to myself, I wonder where in the world roses originated from. So I looked it up. The first written reference to roses was in the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Guess where that's at? Well, if you know, you're lucky, because nobody actually knows where it's at. But they have an idea of the part of the world it was at, because it was in the Bible and the biblical references to it, and that was the Hanging Garden of Babylon. So we're, again, they're eating something that goes way back to the parts of the world that they came from to begin with, and I think that's very interesting to look at that. So I guess in the long run, what I'm trying to get at is the thing about our goats is domestication of our animals is not done. We have got a lot of things to do to get our animals used to our environment here in the United States and in Indiana especially. There has got to be a lot of domestication done to do that. Unfortunately, so many of our goats go back to 4-H herds and show animals, and so our genetic enhancement is going towards show rather than grow. And because of that, we need to be thinking about genetic enhancement as far as grow goes. Getting the goats that are genetically less prone to having worms, doing some checking on them to make sure that we can enhance our worm resistance in our animals. Those are things we need to look at. And also we need to understand too what our animals like. And in our case, when we look at that one forage chart, you know, why weren't my animals eating bluegrass? That told me right there why my animals weren't eating bluegrass. Because they don't like it. And then I ought to give them something else different. I need to be feeding them what they would like to have. Okay, I got questions. I've talked long enough here. Yeah.
So going back to grain,
Yep.
how grain is a drug.
They ain't saying grain is bad, but that's what it does.
I actually am curious because I've actually been told, I've only been working with goats now for about 5 months, and we went to Purdue Animal Hospital and there's a vet clinic there, and 2 of the vets actually said, don't feed grain, it's horrible. So we're still feeding grain, but what would you recommend?
So we're dealing with a ruminant animal here, and it's got a great big old fermentation gut. And so in nature, it's not eating grain. So when we start adding grain into a ruminant diet, we have to do it gradual, always gradual, gradual, gradual. And that means it takes maybe several weeks to do these kind of things. So I always love these stories. I talked to a lady one time, said and this happens all the time, killing goats on grain. It happens a lot. She said, well, yeah, I asked the kid at the feed store how to feed my goat. A little problem right there to begin with. And he said, well, you need to feed it corn. So I gave him a bunch of corn, killed him. Okay, I'll give you another story like that too. So my point being, I think grain, I do feed grain. It has to be a gradual changeover, and you just have to watch your animals. So they'll get diarrhea on you if you don't watch it. If you get overdone, goats get diarrhea fairly easy, and from a lot of different causes, and it's one of the baffling things to me is how to prevent that and what to do with it. So I hold off. I don't go near the amount of grain on my goats that I would proportionately to my cattle. because I hold back on that because I worry about that aspect of them. So I have no problem using grain
I think
whatsoever.
your question was, how do you get them off grain?
How do you get them off it?
Mine was, we milk our goats, and when we're milking them to keep them still, we give them their bucket of grain, and they'll just devour it
Yeah.
while we're milking. So could you supplement that? Would you just use hay or other grasses to just?
So you might look into some alfalfa pellets, just alfalfa pellets. They like them too. That's something that they could come in and consume, would be the alfalfa pellets. So in my hay feeding right now, the one thing I've got is a lot of chaff, a lot of loose alfalfa, and they love that stuff. And so they'll all come in and gather for that. So that might be your grain alternative to bring them into something like that. Another one, and I've never done it before, it would be beet pulp. Anybody ever fed that? I would think of, yeah, not the goat, but people feed it to cattle and cattle. I've never done it to goats. So maybe, don't know this, I'm just thinking, but beet pulp might be a possibility there.
And mark cold turkey or gradual?
Oh, everything. Well, when we're going to forages, it can be a little more fast. It's when going to grains, I got to really do it slow. So you can wean them off into that kind of thing. I don't know about beet pulp. I wonder if that'd work. Yeah.
Could you discuss your rotation process, temporary fencing?
Yeah.
How many days?
So I'll tell you on my herd, I'm going to go back to a picture here. And I am so scared of worms. You see these little guys right here? They never go to the grass. I just feed them hay in a dry lot situation. The moms go out into the rotations, and the moms may get rotated into that great big tall area that's orchard grass or sorghum sudan grass, and they get rotated into that chicory area. I need to develop more pastures to rotate into. My place is on a hill, and it's a little difficult to do, but that's it. But I've really committed myself to not to put the little guys out onto that stuff. I just don't want to deal with the issues of worms and what they can do, because with worms, if you've ever done it before, you can check animals individually by looking at their eyelids, and it's called the fumachin. Many are familiar with it, and I do that very religiously. I look at those animals, I drop their eyelids and see what they look like to see if they got worm issues or not, and then I know to treat that situation. Worm discussion is a good 4 hours here, and the problem with worm discussions is I can say one thing and somebody else will come in and say something else. The one guy will tell you need to put dewormer out there absolutely every 2 months or every month, and the next guy will say, no, you don't want to do that. And when we talk about the vet thing, some vets will tell you that, some will tell you the other. It's just a mess. So I try to prevent having worms on my place. Sorghum sudan grass tall, chicory that has some resistance to worms. Those are the things that I look at. Somebody had a question over here. Yes?
So, I actually have two questions. The first is, can you avoid grains entirely?
Oh, I think so. So here's the issues you run into. In my situation, my females will get grained right before they're bred. It's called a flushing. And so when you grain them during that time, there's a chance they'll ovulate more eggs. And that's been proven to do that. And then once they're been bred, and then we wait a couple more weeks to let the eggs implant, then we go ahead and take them off a grain. And then I'm on just forages. That last month before they kid, I start giving them a grain again, because there's a ketosis issue that we have in goats. Again, I don't have these problems in cattle, but I have these in goats. It's called ketosis, and I start giving them more grain. In your situation, if you were going to do that, I would want to be giving something energy-wise. It's a little bit more energy-wise. Soy hulls. You can buy soy hulls too. They're a very soluble fiber that's out there, and maybe the beet pulps and things like that. So something that's high in energy that I can put into that diet. Because if I don't get them, their bodies warmed up when they have these, the kids, it'll pull them down, right? And they'll go into ketonic, and they'll have a real tough situation. I've never had it. Yes, I have. Yes, I have. And I end up giving them, I forgot one. I end up giving them drenches to try to pull them out of that situation. So, and then while their kids are on them, I definitely want to have high quality feeds on them then. Kids are off, man, we're back out to hay again. Okay. Okay, what's the second one?
So it's always puzzled me about the fact that you can let goats loose in areas that have a lot of thistly plants.
Yeah.
They have no trouble with it, and I'm confused about how they can chew the thistle, without getting thorns in them.
Yeah, they do that, and that's, of course, the classic example is those roses. They got those mouth parts. They can just right in there and grab that and jerk that right off of there and nibble off of that kind of thing. I have stinging nettle in those lots, and I have never, my goats don't go much for stinging nettle. And some people say, well, the younger ones sometimes they go to, but I've never seen them really work over stinging nettle that much in my lots. So, and the bull thistle's sticking out there. They're not tackling that thing either. They don't do that one also. So they can find them with thorn plants, but not so much the nettle type plants. I don't see it there. Thistle types, yeah. Steve, I think should be done. I don't know.
I have maybe another question.
Yep, yes,
I have two.
Yep.
Back to the grain issue again. I have sheep, not
Mhm.
goats.
mm-hmm,
And I use the grain the last trimester and then during breeding.
mm-hmm.
I've been a little cautious with how much I gave them, so my girls are thinner than I would like for them to be. You're suggesting to have some other products, maybe mixing the corn with
Oh, no.
or-
I'm just saying that your best energy production is going to be corn by far. It is way above anything else you're going to have there. So, but if you want energy type things, oats, for example, is not corn, but it's more of a fiber kind of a thing. I'm thinking what we might want to look at is high energy forages kind of thing. Maybe that's what you want to look at to do that.
And maybe mixing alfalfa pellets in with
Yep,
the corn to
something
get
like
more
that.
of a boost, 'cause
Yep.
they're not carrying the weight I want.
The other thing about alfalfa pellets is they're pulling more protein in there too, and you may need that protein too. The alfalfa will give you a lot of nice protein. It's in there. So you might think about doing those kind of things to bring them up. And it's really important. You want to have that coverage. You want those ribs and stuff covered on those animals.
They're not. And
Yeah.
the second question is, you were talking about the preferences for grasses,
Yeah.
and I looked up quick, sheep domesticated in the same part of the world. So are those grass preferences going to be similar to sheep?
I don't know that. I can't tell you that. Kentucky did that research, and I just jumped all over that when I saw that. But I thought, my gosh, I saw that bluegrass. Oh, no wonder that's on there. But I do not know a preference study for sheep. I wouldn't necessarily. That sorghum Sudan grass, definitely. They love that. Purdue did a trial one time, this is years ago. They went out and they planted Sudan grass and brown midrib Sudan grass. And they planted the regular Sudan grass in the shape of a pea, Purdue pea, and they put brown midrib all around it. And the sheep went out there and cleaned up all the brown midrib and left the pea of Sudan grass. They selected that much, okay? So that's how much they like that brown midrib sorghum. They like sorghum to begin with, and they still selected it that way. And they have aerial shots of this Purdue pea out in this field, which they didn't consume. Yeah.
Any comments about any overlap between what the cattle like and what the goats like?
So it's a good rotation. Cattle and goats are a good rotation, and the biggest reason is the worms that cattle get are totally different than the worms goats get, and vice versa. So alfalfa orchard grass is what I've got. You notice orchard grass is not really that high, but that's one of the best perennial grasses that was out there. Steve, I'm done.
Do you put them in the pasture at the same time? Or?
You could, but I don't.